To my latest presentation on duos, which are sort of a unique concept to VGC Draft League. One of the ideas that I came up with this from was a while back. There was this coach that drafted Cresselia and Iron Hands next to each other, and this is a monotype draft, so they're mono-electric. They drafted Cresselia as their electric Terra captain, and it was really, really crazy and really hard to break through those two together. Particularly together because of the fact that when Cresselia would set Trick Room, it would spam Lunar, whatever the Lunar move is, Lunar Blessing, and the Iron Hands was just incredibly difficult to take down, even if you just spam super effective moves. And the Crest just had no weaknesses, which meant it was also really tough. So there's this concept that I came up with that was basically a duo. A duo in VGC Draft is it's two Pokemon that you drafted specifically to sit next to each other on the field and pose some particular threat, and that particular threat can be offensive or defensive, but basically that threat has to be greater than the sum of the two parts that make up the duo. Sometimes they pull equal weight, sometimes they pull less or more weight, but they have to be greater than their parts, basically. And I give some examples of pretty common duos that people have probably heard of. Mouseape is a nightmare. And yeah, it's tough to deal with the threat of offensive mousehold, defensive, supportive mousehold with friend guard, and all of that stuff next to an Annihilate that you can't really damage. And the mousehold could just damage it for it, so that it just gets 350 base power Rage Fist and obliterates your entire team. So you can't attack it, but you have to attack it. Garchomp and Talonflame is a bit more immediate. You basically, with any ground type in Talonflame, you just click Tailwind and then click Earthquake. It's honestly not that deep, but you brave bird at dawn, baby. Oh, and then spam Make It Rain, Tailwind. This one's also pretty simple. But they all have complementary offensive and defensive typings as well. That's really important to note. The first two that I wanted to go over is something that I think is very intentional and very obvious, Dozogiri. If you fully invest in one of Dundozo's stats, you can get it effectively up to this. So it doesn't really matter that you're fighting a 2v1 the entire time, which is the main drawback, and you can't switch out, which means that your opponent can do all sorts of rough stuff to you, and it's pretty predictable. It's also just less independent, so you can't run Tatsugiri and you can't run Dondozo individually nearly as well as you can run them together. And sometimes there's attacks on them. So they're strong, they're reliable. That's Dozogiri in a nutshell. But be careful. The fir- and then this idea of duos does come into play a lot with weather and with terrain. So usually there's a terrain or weather setter, and then there's an abuser. Oftentimes they can kind of overlap with their typings and their offensive presence, but they're very strong just because of the multipliers that are created both offensively and defensively with your weathers or your terrains when you set them up. So effectively, weather is a weather is a multiplier to a specific type. You have your weather warriors, which have Pokemon that abuse abilities like photosynthesis or Sand Veil, Slush Rush, etc. Right? You abuse moves like Electro Shot, you abuse moves like Hurricane or Blizzard, Solar Beam, I suppose, with your Chlorophyll Pokemon, and just generally annoying. Then there's just Pokemon that take advantage of the multipliers that are natural on the field when it comes to their weather. So Tyranitar abuses his sand by just getting a 1.5 times to a special defense, which makes it really hard to take down. You have your fire types that get, like, eruption users that get 1.5 times as strong, which can really hurt. Your rain abusers, primarily like Swift Swim Pokemon or even just generic water types, get a boost to their water moves, which is 1.5 times, which can also really hurt. And then you've got the defensive boost. Baxcalibur becomes a lot more threatening when it's that hard to take down, because it's already bulky, and then you get more bulky because you've got Aurora Veil and you've got the 1.5 times defense. So, weather is all about multipliers, and activating abilities is more of a secondary thing. Terrain is the opposite. We can be unburdened. We can be unburdened by what has been. How astonishing, isn't it? Terrain's main function is to activate electric seeds a lot of the time, or psychic seeds, misty seeds, grassy seeds, respectively, and then just go fast and go really strong immediately. There are multipliers related to the terrain, like, but when are you ever going to take advantage of having the power of dragon moves, or you take advantage of the psychic terrain multiplier, but only because you have an incredibly broken move, like with these three terrains that you can just click and be boosted by the terrain, but it's often actually just used by the setter, like Pincurchin, Rising Voltage. You don't draft another electric type just to click Rising Voltage. But sometimes, but you do often draft another psychic type to click Expanding Force, which I suppose Psychic Terrain's a bit different than the others, but that's basically what you do. And so field conditions, there's weather. Weather is very strong. It's a 1.5 times to a stat. Then there's the 1.3 times you get from terrain to a particular move, unless it's misty terrain. And then you still have other multipliers you can apply to Pokemon in the field too. Vivillon with Friend Guard, or I guess Mousehold or Clefairy with Friend Guard, also apply a multiplier to your other Pokemon, which can protect them from attacks. So that is effectively a field condition as well, and you're setting that up for an attacker to do more damage because it has more longevity. Just thought I'd mention that as well. Also get creative with some of these. A lot of these duos aren't really as creative. Like, yeah, you can be creative with like Weezing and Halucha, I guess, but it's kind of generic. They're very strong for certain, but you gotta think a little bit in order to create duos of Pokemon that, since it's draft, your opponents will expect your weather or your terrain or your friend guard, and they will consider that when prepping. Friend guard's a bit harder to stop, but if your team is so dedicated to weather with your duos that someone can just bring, like, if you have a Sun team, they can just bring Rain Dance, and you get kind of canceled out by that. So just think outside the box when it comes to what two Pokemon work together on the field and aren't as obvious. So we can create our own duos. So you don't have to be obvious with it. You can have reliable duos that are a little bit less clear when your opponent is prepping for you. They might not even see them. Like, I've seen a lot of good things that have been made by other players, and I tried to make some of my own. Like, if you have typings that work well together, like in this case, Salazzle and I think I've seen this one actually. Salazzle and Hydreigon have good typings together. Fairy and Ghost are good typings together. If you cover each other offensively, mostly because you get rid of fairies, which are Hydreigon's main weakness, in this case, you get rid of ground types with your Beartic, which is Glowking's main weakness. And then you have strong interactions between things like abilities. In this case, well, Levitate makes you immune to the ground moves that might hurt your Salazzle, and then you've got Dragon Cheer and Fake Out and all these cool supporting moves. Your interaction between these two, in this case, is that you can't be taunted and you're a Dusclops, which means since you can't be taunted, your Trick Room is kind of free, and you can abuse it kind of with Alchemy. And then, what can these Pokemon accomplish next to each other? And I guess a fourth one is, well, in this case, you set up Trick Room and you set up Snow, and then you go ham with your Beartic. You can spam Dracos and spam Tailwinds and set up all sorts of stuff with these. Set up Trick Room, start to get in your supporting Pokemon, and you've also got to be able to do things with them independently of each other. Like in the case of Dozo Giri, you kind of just send in the Dozo and the Giri, and they are very predictable. And they can't really do it as much when next to other Pokemon in your team. Alchemy decorating something is always going to be useful. Setting up Trick Room is generally going to be useful as well, or ally switching or Wilsping. And then, again, these Pokemon are useful in their own right, independent of each other, but they just work so much better when they're together. That's the idea of a duo. So let's build some. We've seen this duo work very well with some folks over in a league that I've been in. Shout out to Missing Name. On the last one, I should shout out Jordan and, well, this one was made sort of by Jordan. This one was made by Samax. But and then this is very common in VGC at this point, honestly. But there's some cool things you can do. I'm a massive advocate of these two. These two are best buds because, well, they're very good on their own, for certain. Dragapult and Volcarona are both very strong. They're both very likely to punch massive holes in opposing teams. But what they can do together is, it just works. It's very interesting. And I started looking closer at it and I realized that, like, they've got really solid speed tiers, both of them. 100 is really useful. 142 is obviously amazing. And they both have great supporting options, and they both have independent supporting options that support each other really nicely. And independent offensive options as well. So Dragapult sets up screens, it can Thunder Wave opponents, it can be annoying with things like Breaking Swipe, Wisp, well, really fast Wisp. Basically, it just mitigates things that are done to your teammates. You know, that Volcarona acts very differently in the fact that, yes, it can do that as well, it can do it very well, but it can also redirect instead of being the screen setter, being the sort of guy who does everything fast. Volcarona redirects and Volcarona attacks. Dragapult attacks very well as well, and they're very different in terms of their offensive power. It's hard to have something that deals with both Dragapult and Volcarona at the same time, so they can just be very strong when they're next to each other in the field because you don't know what they're going to do. Volcarona is very good at redirecting and dealing with opponents that Dragapult would struggle with otherwise because, like, Sucker Punches, your Ice Shards, your Fairy types in general are very well dealt with by a Rage Powder Volcarona or a QD one, come to think of it. And something like a Choice Band or a Dragon Dance Dragapult is very strong into things like if you have like a Fire type or a Dragon type that might do well into Volcarona, it's going to get blown up by a Dragapult, Dragon Darts, or Draco Meteor before it can really stop Volk. So those two, I haven't been able to explain it before, but they're just so good together. And I've seen them work so well. Just because they're good, they're the ideal example of a duo. Both of them are good independently and they're good together. So I'm very shocked, almost shocked, that These two aren't drafted together more often. Iron Treads, and Iron Treads is a steel ground type, and it's fast, and it's strong offensively, and it's also physically bulky. So, what that means in practice, when paired with Florges, is that you've got especially bulky fairy type that is paired offensively with a ground type and defensively with a steel type that can also consume booster energy. So these two are really strong together, especially when you consider the fact that have they're both good. They have perfect offensive synergy in the fairy and ground. They have ability synergy with symbiosis, giving an item to Iron Treads after it consumes its booster. Iron Treads when it's Iron Tread's very difficult to remove, except for the fact that it has very little recovery. So Pollen Puff can be a really useful tool in that case. It can also sometimes take advantage of a boost from Helping Hand. And I think that this is just a very strong core for a team. Halurk. I love Golurk. And I think that, like, Golurk have very. You have a ground and a flying type together, and a fast Tailwind in particular on a flying type next to a ground type that's really strong with Earthquake, that you also have a fighting type next to a ghost type at the same time. And those are both really strong offensive combinations. Golurk is the power behind Hawlucha in this core. Sorry. So if Hawlucha sets up like a free Tailwind, especially if it gets a boost from Unburden somehow, Golurk is still fast enough at 55 that it can outspeed most things in Tailwind. And it doesn't need to take a turn to boost up for it either. You've also got a fast coaching and a fast encore and a ton of supporting moves that Golurk can really take advantage of, because if a Golurk is supported, it's really strong. It's the 8th fastest Earthquake in the format, and it's the 8th strongest Earthquake in the format, and it's actually the 2nd strongest Ghost move in the format, period, with its Poltergeist, which is really nice since it can't miss, and it is literally 1 point of attack short of Saraledge Poltergeist, which is the strongest. Well, that is when you consider spread, which, again, Cali S is not legal, so it is the strongest. And when you consider what these Pokemon provide independently of each other, it gets more interesting. Because Hawlucha, if you have a terrain, especially, it can make your team very, very fast, very, very quickly. And Golurk, on the other hand, is very good in Trick Room with its 55 speed and nuclear offensive power. So you can create win cons in multiple modes for Pokemon that are usually not going to cost you very much, honestly. So you can get strong cores, you can fill everything out at a very low price even. And here we have Lapgiri. So usually Tatsugiri is friends with Dondozo. That's its main friend. But when there's attacks on Dondozo and it's so obvious, you can get a little creative. You can spam Surf. And then you also have Dragon Cheer on your Lapras that can boost up the Tatsugiri. Tatsugiri is pretty weak. You can, outside of like its water moves, so you can freeze dry anything that resists your water moves. You can even soak an opponent with Tatsugiri and then freeze dry it with Lapras and do a ton of damage. You know, if you need to break through something real quick. Even if you already have Dondozo, you can use Perish Song on your Lapras in order to take advantage of that with Tatsu. And it just has a ton of potential to be really strong. Even though they share the water typing, they don't have any weaknesses that are shared among each other. And that is really, really convenient. So here I have one of my favorite Pokemon in Duos. All these Pokemon, together with Kilowattrel, Battery Judas, can form something really strong. Even though Kilowattrel, on paper, it doesn't look that good because, like, it's frail, it's not super strong, it's vulnerable to priority, but it exemplifies this concept of duos so much that is, when it's paired with a ton of different things, it can become a really dangerous threat. And it shows off the effectiveness of field conditions like rain, or tailwind even. The synergy in typings. Oh, synergy in typings is also very important. You've got to be flexible. Kilowattrel is just flexible enough, it's got enough coverage, and it can deter intimidate, which is also really nice. So, to take a little bit of a closer look at it, people see it as a fast tailwind user. I don't think people see it in the correct light, because Kilowattrel is. It looks like a fast mon that's meant to support the team, but it's really not, in an interesting way. It can be incredibly strong with the wind power when it gets tailwind up. So the reward, it's not as good at setting up tailwind as the pranksters are, but the reward for setting it up is really good. It's the fastest Pokemon with it is the fastest Pokemon that has competitive, and it's also the third strongest Pokemon with competitive after Empoleon and Galarian Articuno, which isn't legal in this format. So it's the second, and by a pretty close margin. And it's got good typing. Electric and flying is pretty solid. It's on the attacking end. It's only resisted by electric, which you don't really struggle with. And you can spam Discharge and Earthquake with it, which means it's good paired with essentially any ground type. It's good paired with Rain, because it's got Hurricane and Thunder and Weather Ball and fast, competitive, and Tailwind. But the problem is that people don't really look at it right. People look at it, they see Tailwind, and it's going to hog the sash in your team. It's going to want Focus Sash or Covert Cloak way more often than not. It's vulnerable to priority moves and multi-hits a lot of the time. So like your Triple Axle, your Ice Shard, your E-Speed, your Sucker Punch even. It won't move before a Prankster will, so it won't be able to set Tailwind before Talonflame or the little bugs, Volbeat and Illumise, or Murkrow would be able to. And if it's your team's only Tailwind, that's a really rough spot to be in because it has to be that supportive piece. And if it has to be a supportive piece, you're gonna have to force it to be sort of a support when it's really not. This isn't a support Pokemon. When you get boosted up by Wood Power competitive, it effectively has 262 base special attack, and that's just with Timid. So Kilowattrel is effectively a setup sweeper that needs that support as well. But that support can come in the form of offensive threats and supporting Pokemon that can really drive out what makes it good in the first place. Like, Hitmontop has Wide Guard and it has Fake Out, and it can enable that Tailwind to be set up as well as abuse it pretty well. Metagross can pressure the things that threaten it, the Ice and Rock types, with its Bullet Punch, and take advantage of Tailwind. Politoed sets Rain, which Kilo can take advantage of with Thunder and Hurricane. Whimsicott creates this Bird Bomb strategy. Basically, Bird Bomb is when you set up Tailwind and then click Discharge with Kilo on the same turn, and basically have a 160 base power spread move. Mamoswine has Ice Shard, but it also has Earthquake, which Ice and Ground pair really well with Electric, and can really, really pressure some things really hard. But that does force Kilo into supporting role more. And also, I forgot to mention Stantler, which can skill swap Intimidate onto opponents and basically trigger competitive manually. So this is a setup sweeper who needs his friends. Just like all other Pokemon need their friends to function just as well, just as humans do. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you around, okay?